Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. Today we're going to be talking about what is the most well-known aspect or moment of Elijah's life. You've probably heard multiple sermons or lessons on this. It's a big deal, and it's kind of a weirder scene in the life of Elijah. And there's a lot of meat on the bone. There's a lot of historical context that it's hard for us to understand. There's a lot of really awesome applicable messages that I think are really easy for us to grab and talk about in our modern context. And there's also just a lot of what is going on here and what is all that God is trying to communicate in this text. Jason, will you do a quick just overview of our passage in 1 Kings chapter 18 that we will be talking about today?
Yeah, so 1 Kings 18, basically verses 16 through the end of the chapter. What you have there is, so last time we saw Elijah, he was talking with Obadiah, and Obadiah had quelled his fears enough. He's going to go talk to Ahab. It's fascinating. He goes to Ahab, and it's a really quick interchange. So I'm wondering, it's like Obadiah, what was I afraid of? But they set up the meeting, they meet, and basically set up this, and Elijah kind of takes the reins and says, here's how this should go. The sticking point here, how do I say this? The main symptom of Ahab's disobedience was they started to worship Baal, and they have these hundreds of prophets. And so Elijah sets up this showdown, as it were. And basically, it's like, you guys go first, and whoever's God provides fire wins. And so basically, it goes on half the day, and the prophets of Baal don't do it. Elijah does do it. God does do it. The prophets are all slaughtered. That's the actual word used. The people are like, yeah, we're with you. And towards the end, it says that God basically empowers Elijah to run, tuck his cloak and into his belt, and runs ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel, which is over a marathon worth of running to get there. And so that ends that story, and then it sets us up for what happens in 19. So with all that in mind, again, like Connor said, so much we could bounce off here, and we'll just see where we are at as it nears the end of our time, whether we need to do a part 2 with this. But just considering that whole scenario, what strikes you? What sticks out to you, Connor?
Yeah, you had mentioned it at the beginning of your your explanation of your overview of what happened in this passage. But I do think it is just important that we maybe bring it out a little bit. The idea that there doesn't seem to be immediate consequences for Obadiah, and the fact that he goes to Ahab to tell him about Elijah, to show him or bring him to Elijah. And you get the sense, like we talked about last week, there is a deep immediate fear. You might even say that earlier in the chapter, that Obadiah is deeply afraid of what is going to happen to him and to the people that he's protecting. And you almost get the sense of Obadiah's sense is that if I bring you, then you're going to die. I'm going to die. All the people I'm protecting are not going to survive. And it may be, if eventually Elijah was not successful and the prophets of Baal actually won, or something else had happened, that maybe it would be that then Ahab would then turn on Obadiah, and it would not work out like he had feared. But yeah, it is interesting to see in Scripture a deep, real, honest, and completely understandable fear that a person of God has. And it's completely reasonable. And then to see that fear not even really addressed. It is addressed by the fact that nothing happens, nothing comes of the fear. But yeah, the massive grace that Obadiah and the people he's protecting have, that that Yahweh wins and that they are going to live and be protected and all this good stuff. That's massive and that's big. But yet there is no it's cool to me that it's not a bigger point here, that it's just this one throwaway verse, but yet in that there is something so relatable and so applicable to us today.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's the big thing is I recognize that we have a hard time distinguishing fear and fearful thinking from discernment. And I think we've been taught to honor fear. I think we've called fear discernment, or prudence, or however you want to think about that. It's that idea of when something scary comes up, if you don't react in fear, something's wrong with you. Instead of saying, or maybe that's just the question, what is the godly response to truly frightening things? Because the Bible doesn't give any hint that Ahab's not a threat. Clearly, we're one chapter away from Elijah treating him like an incredible threat, which is funny, the turn, because Elijah's been almost cavalier, just like, yeah, whatever, kind of thing. So it's interesting that in a very short time, he's playing the role of Obadiah, in terms of fearfulness. But specifically to Obadiah, here's a guy who I would say knows Ahab better than anybody, is genuinely terrified of him. And I don't think the Bible gives us any sense that Obadiah should be shamed. Mm-hmm. I do think that Obadiah, and I think this is the better way to think about it, he had an opportunity for this to be a richer experience for him, to go in peacefully. Now, to his credit, he had courage. He fought his fear, and he actually, he created the meetup and everything. But it does ask me, what is it I'm afraid of? And I might have many good reasons. Well, the world is chaotic, and everything's going to happen, this kind of thing. And I've had all these bad experiences in my past, and that can certainly happen again. And those answers all could be yes, and yet. Mm-hmm. I could experience life in a much richer way if I just would stop and say, okay, God, what is it you want? And give me discernment. I'm not denying my fear, but it's also not running my show.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder if this actually is playing out in the richest way possible for Obadiah. Sometimes we do have these fears, and we do need to have wise discernment in terms of the chance of violence, or the chance of extreme persecution for us or for the people that we love, and Obadiah addresses that fear, and without condemnation, without any fear, without any sort of backlash, God addresses that fear and moves on. And so we don't get the direct perspective of what God is doing in the specific situation, or how he wants Obadiah to handle it. But I also wonder, because nothing comes of it, my natural response is to go, well, he had nothing to fear. But I do wonder, instead, is this was it good, because Obadiah was responsible for all these people, to have this natural fear and then to choose God? And so the answer, maybe the answer for me oftentimes is not that I had to not fear or not discern, but this is what a really good picture of truly living in the fullness and the richness of the peace that God offers us, and that can look a lot like having a fear, being rightly discerning over a particularly hard situation, and then ultimately nothing comes of it, and I see that God protects and God is good, and yeah, I would just love more perspective from God. Obviously, I love more perspective from God, but I also love more perspective from Obadiah in terms of how he views his previous fears.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how the story just leaves him behind. He doesn't show up anymore. From my memory, I don't think he shows up anymore in this particular story. And so it is that fascinating dynamic. And I do think something you said is really important and bears repetition, is this idea there is no suggestion that you should not feel fear. The question is, what do you do with it? And I think it says a lot about Obadiah of just owning in the conversation. He's not saying, well, Elijah, I'll think about it. Because I think that's what I do. I'm like, well, I'll think about it. I ain't never going to do that, But he's really upfront. He's like, man, that scares me. This is going to go bad for me. And he allows God to speak into his life by way of Elijah. And we don't want to assume that's the only way God's communicating with him, to calm him enough to exercise courage and say, you know what, that's the right thing to do. Because it's not like this happened 5 seconds apart. Obadiah had to make the trip back to find where Ahab was, and then let him know, hey, here's what's up. And we have no sense of that conversation.
Yeah, being able to acknowledge the full fear and the full responsibility and the anxiety that Obadiah had then allows him to fully appreciate the protection that God offers him.
Absolutely.
So what's a thing for you that sticks out?
Oh, man, we should just keep discussing that forever. Okay, so if I'm forced to change gears, I love the response of Elijah to Ahab. So I'm in verse 17. When he sees Elijah, he says, is that you troubler of Israel? And he's like, hey, I didn't make trouble. You made trouble, And I wonder how much this comes up in my life that idea of, I have said too many people, maybe too many people, hey, I want to be the easy part of the system. You know what I mean? And part of it is reaction. I grew up with, let me just say it this way. I carry in me the weight of, oh no, here's the minister. What's the minister going to ask for? I'm used to ministers being perceived as high maintenance. You better not get on the wrong side of them. And maybe Christians in general, I've referenced before, I can remember being in public places and somebody cussing and my mom saying, hey, can you not say that I'm a Christian, with the expectation that person would just be, oh, I'm sorry. And they did every time, So my pendulum has swung a little too far where I'm like, I remember I've worked with schools and stuff and I'm like, look, I don't want to be the hard part here. I want to be the easy part. You got enough hard stuff going on. At the same time, that can make me worship at the wrong altar, the altar of I don't want to get in anybody's way, and the altar of if it's difficult, I must be doing something wrong. But it's not just, I think Ahab is speaking for the whole country to the degree that the whole country knows about that interaction several years ago, that it's like, this is Elijah's fault, and it was so that dynamic of, so we're dipping back into the last chapter, but that dynamic of Ahab forcing people to swear, like whole nations to swear that they were not harboring Elijah, that's shocking. This is serious. So I have no reason to believe that Ahab has not made Elijah the public enemy number one in everybody's mind, which probably reflects why later in this particular account that when Elijah's like speaking, he's like, hey, what are you guys going to decide? And everybody's like, nothing. You know what I mean? It's like, you're the bad guy in this story. Like, you're not the good guy. Because the truth is, if you're worshiping an idol, let's say you're the governor of Oklahoma, and you're worshiping an idol, I'm like, that's wrong. But then if you also pass a bill where I don't get to eat for a couple years and, I'm having to scrounge, I'm like, I don't care about your idol worship at all. I need food on the table. So,
that's really
and actually doing that, if another person, if there is a lieutenant governor or whatever that said, I think he's the enemy, you know what I mean? And I would stop thinking. So from the day-to-day life, the person worshiping the idol, yes, he's a general threat, but the guy keeping me from eating and drinking freely, that guy's the enemy. So it really reframes, to me, the other piece that jumps out at me is I cannot forget these guys are really hungry and thirsty because despite the fact that Elijah totally upsets the whole apple cart, think about the relationship between Ahab and these prophets that are killed. He goes, hey, there's rain coming. You can go eat or drink. Ahab just leaves. He's like, oh, that supersedes the offense that you just killed on my people.
Yeah, and man, that's a really important man, I am so glad that you brought that up because I was ready, or later on when Elijah presents the question to the people of basically are they going to choose Baal or are they going to choose Yahweh, and they keep totally silent, and I was kind of ready to not lay into them, but say something snarky or whatever I was going to say, but now I go yeah, of course they're just on the side of food, they're on the side of survival, and I don't think God would, I don't think God in that moment would necessarily blame them. And later on, we'll talk about it more, but the prophets of Baal are slaughtered by Elijah. And Ahab, the king, who was also worshiping Baal, and the people who were going along with the worship of Baal are not put to death. And I do wonder for the people, is this an example of God showing grace to these people? Because I love to think that I am the one that's going to stand up, if there's a famine or persecution, and I'm going to be the one that says, I don't care if I eat or drink. I will not bow down to, your God or whatever it would be. But then you throw in my daughter and my wife, and then I'm saying, no, then it becomes much more serious. Then I go, could I honestly, and would that be what God wants me to do? Would God want me to sacrifice my daughter's next meal or having a meal at all, on the face of being able to, sometimes he might call for that, and sometimes he probably wouldn't. And so that's, I think, that one that gives me a lot more compassion for the people of Israel.
I think that's a tremendous point. So as you're talking, I'm like, okay, is their response the righteous response in saying nothing? Because is everything in their being like, you're the bad guy here? How can the guy, so we'll take it all the way out, how can a good God, would a good God really, separate us from, food and, they're alive, obviously they've had some food, but you don't have drought for 3 years in a culture like that. and not have deprivation. You know what I mean? And with the king saying, look, this goes back to last chapter, we're going to have to kill all these animals, unless we find them some water to drink, And so the assumption is his animals would be the last to go, so that means probably all their animals have been killed, you know what I mean, because they were dying anyway. So to sit there and for the guy that is I just can't imagine any perspective on this that wouldn't have him at least equally problematic to the average citizen, and then to say, hey, are you going with me? Or like, the guy that killing us. Yeah. So them saying nothing, maybe by faith, we're not going to side with this guy, with Ahab, but you're not looking. I mean, what have you given us to show us?
And especially, it's important to remind ourselves, because, and again, I might not argue that this is a completely biblical view, but our natural view in the 21st century is to go, oh, it's so silly worshiping, Baal, this false god doesn't exist. And honestly, from stuff that I've been reading a lot recently, I don't know if that's a completely biblical view, but that's kind of the common view, and that's my first inclination when I read about these other gods that people worship in the Old Testament. But yet, very real for them, right? So there's a choice that they're being asked to make between Baal and between Yahweh. And you have Yahweh. And again, for the average commoner who's not super involved in politics, it's completely rational to be well, you have one God that is not coming through, is actually causing us to be hungry and causing this death. And then you have Baal, and it's and he seems very similar to, Yahweh in some ways. And he seems, but ultimately, I'm putting the blame, I've been told by my king that it's Yahweh's fault. I've been told by the people in power that it's not Baal's fault. And then you have Yahweh completely come through, and there's almost this, you have Yahweh come through in terms of the sacrifice, and there's almost this fervor that overcomes the people, almost the deep fear. That's what's fascinating to me, is that this is what eventually moves them, right, the people, to choose Yahweh, even though they probably would have been pretty upset or not totally on Yahweh's side before that. So it's really fascinating to think about. I know I just flew all over the board there, but it's just one of those conversations where I think you might have to listen to us on 0.8 speed or something like that to slow us down to fully connect where all we're going. But there's so much meat on the bone in terms of the story and in terms of empathy. And I'm wondering, I had never thought about the story as one of the things that God wants to communicate through the story is empathy. But then I go, man, how could I not? And of course, if I was in the position of the prophets of Baal, again, I'm not advocating being a prophet of another god, but if what I saw was that, if I was in their position, I would almost certainly act in a similar manner. I can't imagine I'd act differently.
Yeah, so I'm going to double down on this just a little bit, because this was not what occurred to me prior to us pushing record on this podcast, but I'm now captivated by this whole dynamic. So I don't know if Elijah has spoken to the people at all up to this point. There's nothing in biblical record that I'm aware of, where Elijah meets with the people and says, hey, people, some kind of, individualized, even a small remnant, even the 100 prophets, that Obadiah is hiding. So basically he goes to Ahab and says, look, this is going to happen. The people, the common person, never hears his side of the story. It's just at some point there's no water. And they would be much more tuned into it than I am, because when rain is in forecast for me, I'm like, oh, I should wear a raincoat. But I've hung around enough farmers that they are paying meticulous attention to, okay, rain, now we need it how much and where from, and what will the temperature of the rain be, and the speed of the rain and all this, So these people would be much more agriculturally tuned in, so that would be a huge thing. So what is being said by the prophets of Baal and whoever communicates for Ahab during this time? I can't imagine these two things weren't said. Number one, the bad guy is Elijah. But number two, here's the reason why this is happening. Mm-hmm. And I think we do this all the time. Oh, there's this major catastrophe, and we get super offended when somebody says, well, I'm not saying you shouldn't be super offended. I'm just asking you to think. We get super offended if somebody said, well, God brought this disaster. God brought 9/11. God brought AIDS. God brought, COVID. God brought whatever, And I think it's right for a person to say, how do you know that? And the truth is we don't. So we got to be careful with asserting, I speak for God on this. Simultaneously, people that are spiritual people will say, well, the reason that the life is like this now is this. And based on my present wisdom, I'm like, okay, I can see that. I can see that. So now I'm functionally, I can still be claiming to worship Yahweh, but I'm not even asking Yahweh about it. I'm using the conventional wisdom, maybe of the church, maybe of what we'd call the world. And I'm like, that's where these people were. They had not heard from Elijah. All they know is suddenly they're being invited, and you've got, even on sheer number, you got Elijah here, the bad guy, I'll remind us again, and then you got these 450 people who probably look pretty good to them. They did not, I don't think the prophets of Baal look like hideous, evil devils. You know what I mean? I think these were the people that had been actually talking to them throughout this hardship. They may actually have been the people that were comforting them. You know, I don't know how the prophets of Baal's daily activity were, but I assume they were, certainly we can say they were mingling much more with the common man than Elijah was, because he was around basically two people this whole time.
So I want to spin it forward like maybe another 1,000 years or a little bit less than that into the time of Jesus. And this seems to be a rhythm that keeps on being repeated throughout the story of God's people, of God's chosen people, and that God brings his people close to him, then they reject him, they turn away from him, they choose their own way, and then God keeps bringing them back. God keeps on bringing in prophets and saving them, and it's just this continual cycle that goes throughout the Old Testament and then even into the New Testament. And so you get, like, if I'm a person in Jerusalem and I've stood at the back of a crowd and heard Jesus preach one time, and I've heard of a healing here or there. It sounds cool, but I've not directly seen it. And I tried to go see him speak at the temple, but it was like super crowded. Maybe I'm a lesser than person, so I'm not even really allowed in the temple, and I'm on the outskirts. But then you have the people that talked to the Pharisees who said, "Man, this Jesus guy, he's really, he's really like he's bad news. He's the one who's going to cause all this trouble and all this pain and all this oppression that's going to come against you." And then you find yourself in the crowd, you're chanting Barabbas, yada 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 yada. I think this is what we have today in our story of Elijah is like it's an even more drastic example, because like you said, we don't know how much direct public access Elijah has had. And so I'm just wondering here, and I'm gonna have to do some more study and some more work through here. I think God obviously gets very frustrated with his people continually turning away and choosing to worship these false gods over him. And yet I still am wondering here, like, is there a streak of empathy and sympathy and understanding that God has for his people? Because how could he not? And you begin to read the subtext of these stories and you go, yeah, like, is the empathy that God has. Obviously, God has deep love for the people that chanted Barabbas when it was a choice between him and Jesus. But then do I go, man, not only does God have deep love for them, but does he have deep understanding? And how far does that deep understanding and that radical desire for them, like what does that mean for a God that knows all, understands all, and loves all? Like, what does that look like? And then, man, if I can place myself in that mindset, how much more loving does that allow for me to be? How much more accepting of people's failures and faults and what I would see as completely false perspectives and completely wrong and harmful ideas? If I can go, man, if I can really understand them and know, yeah, I totally see how they've got there, and it's harmful. It doesn't take away that I want them to change or I want their ideas to shift or their behavior to change, but go, yeah, there's an element where I go, how could this not be a struggle? How could this not be a place where they ended up to one degree or the other?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm that application. It occurred to me, when I guess Trump was the first one to really promote the idea of fake news. It's like, well, that's fake news. And I remember when I first started, I'm like, yeah. I mean, I always assume there's fake news around. I never really thought about it. Because there was fake news in the time of Jesus and there's fake news in the time of Elijah. You know what I mean? It's like whoever holds the power shapes the narrative. Mm-hmm. And as Christians, we should always be, I don't think we should be cynical by any means, but I do think we should be aware the devil's always working, and anybody that's not for God is more prone to align with the devil, And so that's what Elijah's experiencing. That's what the people are experiencing. I also think who's responsible, or what are you responsible to? The prophets of Baal, they get slaughtered, and now that begs the question. We can deal with that maybe in the next episode by this point, but it's this idea of, okay, did God want them all to be slaughtered? Is that an Elijah thing? Was that free will for Elijah's part? That kind of thing. Why weren't the people slaughtered? Why weren't the people that had no answer, that didn't stand up and say, no, I'm with Yahweh, And I'm not suggesting they should have been. My question is the why, because then that drifts back or projects, I guess, forward to me. Like what does God expect of me in this culture? Like, am I, and then every Christian expect it? And then furthermore, I'm the minister in these situations. I'm the leader in most of these situations. Like, there's very few settings I'm in where people aren't aware that I'm the professional Christian here, and then I go to James where it's like, hey, be careful if you're going to step forward as the teacher, because you're going to be judged more highly. And I think that has many manifestations. But it's like, what is my responsibility? Remembering Obadiah is certainly a man of God in this situation, and he is quiet as well.
Yeah, and I think it's so. I think it's so important. Lots of preachers and lots of ministers and lots of Christians will talk about, man, if you want to stand up and teach, or have a podcast or whatever it is, like, you need to be prepared to give an account for what you taught. And yet we never really take the full step forward to go, well, if I sat under Jason for 30 years as he preached and he was not faithful to what it was, like, is God just going to be like, well, when it comes to final judgment, will God just be like, well, you spent 30 years trying, like, being misled, being completely led down a wrong path, but you tried, you thought you were honestly going to live full life, but you were being deceived, you were completely wrong, and I'm sorry, but that sucks to suck for a better term. But I and so here, like, I think this is where I always end up in terms of what is the ultimate fate of everybody. And, it's always a big question that lots of Christians and lots of non-believers ask, like, well, what happens to the person? What happens to somebody, after they die if they didn't choose Jesus? And maybe the answer is the classic answer. But then I also go, like, man, like, God over and over, and there's a lot more I could go down this, but God over and over and over again is showing drastic understanding for the context, giving grace and understanding to people who have been misled and oppressed by the people that have power over them. And I think it's just a really important thing to remind ourselves. One, when, like, we're having this podcast right now, and so that means we need to be we're going to be held accountable for the things that we speak now, and we'll always be held accountable for the things we say and do, but to a greater extent. And also, I think we always just need to take a step further to always ask the question of, man, what then does that mean for the grace of God for the people that we misled? Or what does that then mean for the ultimate salvation of the people that had been oppressed and had been misled and even participated in an unjust, unfair system? Like, what does that mean for them? And what does grace look like for them in that situation? And yeah, I mean, I don't have the answers for what it exactly looks like, but I don't think it is as cut and dry as most ministers would like you to believe.
Yeah, I think in general, I just think it's always been messy from the human perspective. I don't think, well, I was going to say, in Abraham's time, I don't think people are like, man, that Abraham, he's just the most righteous guy ever. If they had any sense of, you mean the guy that twice put his wife in a situation where she could have been sexually assaulted repeatedly with no recourse, and it's like, yeah, that guy, But the truth is, most people didn't even know him. So you have the father of our faith, from a spiritual point of view, the most important person walking the earth during that era. Nobody knows him, or few people know him relative to the whole populace of humanity. But on any specific story, I don't think you're sitting there when Joseph is giving, made second in command of Egypt. I don't think you're like, oh, this is really clean. Like, this seems really clean. Moses shows up and he's like, hey, I'm letting my people go. They're like, oh, good. This is going to be smooth and clean. Matter of fact, God seems to go to great lengths to say, it's a mess. It's a mess. And only because we have this bird's eye view do we think, oh, it was so clean. It was a mess. It's always been a mess. God never says, I'm going to clean it all up, then I'll start working. He's like, yeah, again, I cannot shake this, our podcast from a few weeks ago. He chose to leave the weeds in. And so when I look around in my world, and I hear this from people, and I've heard it for years, but the world's getting worse and worse. It's never been this bad, And I'm like, well, by what metric? First of all, because in many ways we're safer than we've ever been, versus other eras. But okay, it's a mess. Yeah, this is the only way it's ever been. And it that comes from this idealized thing, well, back in the 20s, the 30s, the 80s, the 90s, whatever you think of is the idealized time. It's like, no, it was a mess then. It was always been a mess. And within the mess, people find great advantage and great disadvantage. But the question always put to them is, will they trust God with their mess? And that's what it is. And he is very, very clear that he works one-on-one. He doesn't work in collectives. Even when he's destroying whole nations, there is a definite sense that he's working. I've judged every single person, which is hard for us to contemplate, but in this case, he honors free will. And when free will is made toward him, he seems to preserve that, So now applying that today, tough. It's tough. But I do think it's really important to recognize this is on the ground. If you're watching this, chaos. And we haven't even got to the more chaotic pieces of this story, but chaos. But when you look at it through God's view, he's like, I got this. Like, calm down, come on, keep with me. And he's okay if we have tiny, tiny faith, which you can almost barely see, to stand up and shout it kind of faith. And that is not human. I elevate the stand up and shout at people for me much more than the, I'm kind of for you people. But God's like, I'll take whatever you can give me. And that's the message to me that I carry away is trust him. If you can trust him small, great. If you can trust him big, great. But trust him.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think we are going to keep having our conversation, but we're going to cut it here and then come back where we left off. And you will hear that next week. And so, we look forward to finishing this conversation and would love to hear your thoughts on it. Grace, peace, and love.